I watched a man's eyes turn to ice while he begged for mercy. His screams still echo in my sleep 50 years later. They gave me a white lab coat and called it science. They handed me a clipboard and called it research. They showed me how to measure a human being's suffering in degrees Celsius and called it progress. My name is Takeshi Yamamoto. I was a scientist at Unit 731, a place you've never heard of, conducting experiments your worst nightmares couldn't imagine. For 3 years, I told myself I was saving lives. I was wrong. And the most terrifying part? It wasn't the torture that haunts me most. It's how easily I convinced myself to participate. How quickly the unthinkable became routine. How a good man becomes a monster, one rationalization at a time. What I'm about to tell you isn't just history, it's a warning. Because the person I was, educated, moral, certain I could never do evil, that person is closer to who you are than you want to believe. And that should terrify you. I need you to understand something before I continue. I wasn't a monster. At least, I didn't think I was. It was the spring of 1938 when I received the letter. I was 26 years old, fresh out of medical school at Tokyo Imperial University, ranked 3rd in my graduating class. The letter bore an official seal, the kind that made your hands tremble when you held it. It was an invitation to join a special research unit in Manchuria, working on advances in preventative medicine and epidemic control. My mother cried when I showed her the letter, but they were tears of pride. Her son, selected for such important work. My father, a retired military officer, clasped my shoulder with a grip that said everything words couldn't. I was going to serve my country. I was going to save lives. I remember the train ride north like it was yesterday. The landscape changed from the familiar mountains of home to the flat, endless plains of Manchuria. Other young scientists filled the car with me, all of us buzzing with the nervous energy of people about to do something important. We talked about research, about breakthroughs, about the diseases we would conquer. None of us talked about the war. We pretended it didn't exist, even as we traveled through it. The facility was massive. Ping Fang, they called it. From the outside, it looked like any other military complex. Imposing brick buildings, guard towers, high walls. But it was what they told us inside that should have sent me running. Commander Ishii gathered all the new recruits in a conference room on our first day. He was a short man with round glasses that made his eyes look bigger than they were, like an owl perpetually surprised by its own thoughts. But when he spoke, everyone listened. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "we are on the verge of the greatest medical advances in human history. While others waste time with theoretical research and animal testing, we have been given a unique opportunity. Here at Unit 731, we will use real human subjects to understand the limits of the human body, the nature of disease, and the mechanics of survival." I should have questioned it then. I should have asked what he meant by real human subjects. But I was young, ambitious, and so desperate to believe in something larger than myself. He continued, "The subjects we use are not innocent civilians. They are prisoners of war, criminals, and spies who would otherwise be executed. Instead of wasting their deaths, we are giving them the opportunity to contribute to science, to potentially save millions of lives through their sacrifice." The word sacrifice felt wrong in my mouth when I tried to repeat it later. Because sacrifice implies choice, doesn't it? But I pushed that thought down, buried it beneath layers of rationalization and national duty. They gave us lab coats that first day, crisp, white, pristine. I remember thinking how official it made everything feel, how legitimate. We weren't soldiers with guns. We were men of science with microscopes. There was a comfort in that distinction that I clung to desperately. My assignment was in the frostbite research division. I was told that understanding how the human body responded to extreme cold could save countless soldiers fighting in harsh climates. It made sense. It sounded noble, practical. Dr. Yoshimura, my supervisor, was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that never seemed to stop moving. He spoke about frostbite with the passion of an artist discussing his craft. The key, he explained during my orientation, is understanding the exact temperature and duration required to induce varying degrees of tissue death. Previous research has been limited by ethical constraints and inadequate testing methods. Here, we have no such limitations. No such limitations. The phrase echoed in my mind as he showed me the laboratory. A sprawling room filled with equipment I recognized and equipment I didn't. There were water baths that could be supercooled to -40 degrees, wind machines, pressure chambers, and in the corner, a large freezer unit that hummed with a sound that would later fill my nightmares. "Tomorrow," Dr. Yoshimura said with something like excitement in his voice, "we have 3 new subjects arriving. You'll observe first, then slowly take on more responsibility as you become comfortable with our procedures." Comfortable. As if comfort was something that could exist in a place like this. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my narrow bed in the barracks, listening to the sounds of other scientists settling in for the night. Someone was snoring softly. Someone else was writing a letter home, the scratch of pen on paper carrying through the thin walls. I tried to picture my mother's face, my father's proud smile. I reminded myself why I was here, to save lives, to advance medicine, to serve something greater than myself. But in the darkness, another voice whispered questions I wasn't ready to answer. What kind of research requires people to be prisoners? What kind of science can't be questioned? I pushed those thoughts away and closed my eyes, forcing myself toward sleep. Tomorrow, I would begin my work. Tomorrow, I would see what we really did at Unit 731. Tomorrow, everything would change. The subjects arrived at dawn. I heard them before I saw them. The shuffle of feet, the clank of chains, voices speaking in languages I didn't understand. Chinese mostly, some Russian. I stood at the window of the laboratory, my new lab coat still stiff and uncomfortable, watching as guards herded a line of people across the courtyard. They didn't look like criminals. They didn't look like spies. They looked like people, ordinary people. A man who might have been a farmer, his hands calloused and rough. A younger man, maybe my age, with glasses that caught the morning light. A woman, I hadn't expected women, holding herself with a dignity that made my chest tight. "Don't stare at them like that." I turned to find Dr. Yoshimura behind me, carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression of mild disapproval. "Like what?" I asked. "Like they're human," he said simply. "It makes the work harder. We call them logs here, maruta. It's easier that way. They're specimens, research materials, no different than the rats and rabbits you worked with in university." But they were different. Every instinct in my body screamed that they were different. 3 of the logs were brought to our laboratory. 2 men and the woman I'd seen. They were stripped of their outer clothing and given thin cotton garments that would provide no protection against cold. Standard procedure, Dr. Yoshimura explained, to eliminate variables in our testing. The older of the 2 men kept his eyes down. He had learned not to look at us directly. But the younger man, the one with glasses, met my gaze for just a moment. In that second, I saw something that would haunt me. Not fear, not anger, but a desperate, pleading question. Why? I looked away first. "Today's experiment is straightforward," Dr. Yoshimura announced, consulting his notes. "We're testing the rate of frostbite development in various extremities when exposed to different negative temperatures. Subject A will have his hands submerged in water at -20 degrees. Subject B, -30 degrees. Subject C, -40 degrees. The woman was subject C. I don't know why that detail stuck with me, but it did. They were led to stations where large metal buckets had been prepared, filled with water kept at precise temperatures through a combination of ice, salt, and cooling mechanisms. The water had a strange, syrupy quality from being so cold. "The key is to monitor the exact time to tissue crystallization," Dr. Yoshimura continued, as if he were explaining a routine chemistry experiment. "We'll take measurements every 5 minutes. Yamamoto, you'll be recording data for Subject C." My hands shook as I picked up the clipboard. The woman was positioned at her station, her face carefully blank. She understood what was about to happen. They always understood. A guard forced her hands into the bucket of supercooled water. The scream that tore from her throat was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't just pain, it was shock, horror, disbelief that human beings could do this to another human being. Her whole body convulsed, trying to pull away, but the guards held her firm. "Note the time," Dr. Yoshimura said calmly. "Initial immersion, 07:34. I wrote it down. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely read my own writing. The woman's screams turned to sobs, then to a low, keening sound that was somehow worse. Her face had gone white, lips blue, eyes wide glassy with shock. But she was still conscious. They kept her conscious. That was part of the experiment, to observe the subject's responses in real time. After 5 minutes, Dr. Yoshimura approached with calipers and a thermometer. He lifted one of her hands from the water, she couldn't pull it out herself anymore, and began taking measurements. The skin had turned a waxy white, with dark purple patches spreading from the fingertips. "Temperature of tissue, -15 degrees, he dictated. "Significant crystallization evident in dermal layer. Tissue rigid. Continue immersion." He placed her hand back in the water. She made a sound like a wounded animal. I recorded every word he said, every measurement, every observation.
My handwriting became steadier as I forced myself into the mechanical process of documentation. It was easier than thinking about what I was witnessing. This went on for 45 minutes. At the end, when they finally pulled her hands from the water, they were solid, frozen completely through. Dr. Yoshimura tapped them with a metal instrument, and they made a sound like knocking on wood. "Excellent data," he said with satisfaction. "The crystallization rate exceeded my predictions. Tomorrow we'll test thawing methods." The woman had fainted somewhere around the 30-minute mark. I was grateful for that, at least. Grateful that she didn't have to be conscious when they examined her frozen hands like they were interesting sculptures. The guards carried the 3 subjects away. The older man was walking, barely. The younger man had to be supported. The woman was unconscious, her frozen hands hanging at unnatural angles. Dr. Yoshimura began cleaning the equipment, humming softly to himself. "You did well, Yamamoto. First time is always difficult, but you'll adjust. Everyone does." I stood there, holding my clipboard, covered in data about tissue crystallization rates and temperature gradients, and felt something inside me crack. But I didn't say anything. I didn't object. I didn't walk away. I just nodded and began preparing for tomorrow's experiments. That's the part I can never forgive myself for. Not what I witnessed, but what I accepted. 3 weeks passed before I stopped vomiting after experiments. That's what they don't tell you about atrocity. How quickly the abnormal becomes routine. How the human mind adapts to protect itself, building walls between what you do and whom you think you are. The woman with the frozen hands didn't survive the thawing experiments. Her tissue had crystallized too deeply, and when Dr. Yoshimura attempted various rewarming methods, the cellular damage was catastrophic. Gangrene set in rapidly. She developed a fever that spiked to lethal levels within 48 hours. I recorded every detail in my notebook. Time of death, 23:17. Cause, septic shock secondary to tissue necrosis. Contributing factors, extensive frostbite, cellular rupture, systemic infection. Clean clinical language, as if words could sanitize what we'd done. The other scientists helped me adjust. They had their own coping mechanisms, their own ways of surviving what we did every day. Dr. Tanaka from the Plague Research Division drank. Every evening he'd sit in the common room with a bottle of sake, getting progressively quieter until he'd stumble to his quarters. Once, deep in his cups, he'd grabbed my arm and whispered, "Do you know what keeps me awake? Not their screams. I got used to those. It's the silence after. That's what haunts me." Then he'd laughed, a broken sound, and poured another drink. Dr. Nakamura, who worked in the pressure chamber division, became obsessively religious. He'd pray before every experiment, whispering words I couldn't quite hear, his hands pressed together so tightly his knuckles went white. I asked him once what he was praying for. "Forgiveness," he said, "and that when my time comes, my judgment will be swift." But most of us simply disconnected. We stopped seeing the subjects as people and started seeing them as data points. It was the only way to function. I became efficient. That's the word Dr. Yoshimura used when he praised my work. Efficient. I could set up an experiment in half the time it took other researchers. My notes were meticulous. My observations were detailed and unemotional. I learned to look at a human being and see only variables to measure, reactions to record. The laboratory became my entire world. We worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7 when important research was underway. The facility was self-contained. We rarely left the compound. There was a commissary, sleeping quarters, even a small recreation room where we could read or play cards during our limited free time. It was easy to forget there was a world beyond those walls, a world where doctors healed instead of destroy, where science sought to preserve life rather than document its destruction in excruciating detail. My research on frostbite expanded. We tested different body parts, feet, ears, noses, entire limbs. We experimented with various temperatures, exposure times, wind speeds. We froze subjects completely, then attempted revival. Most died. Some survived, but wished they hadn't. I became particularly focused on the phenomenon of ice crystal formation in living tissue, the way water molecules arrange themselves during the freezing process, the damage patterns they created, the relationship between freezing speed and cell viability. It was fascinating from a purely scientific standpoint, groundbreaking even. I wrote papers about it, internal reports that would never see publication but were circulated among military medical leadership. My work was praised. I was contributing to the war effort, they said. Potentially saving lives, they said. I started to believe them. That's the insidious thing about rationalization. It doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual, a slow erosion of conscience that you don't notice until you're standing somewhere you never imagined you'd be. I remember the day I realized how far I'd fallen. It was during a routine experiment, if anything we did could be called routine. We were testing the effects of rapid temperature change on frozen tissue. The subject was a middle-aged man who had been at the facility for 2 months. His right arm had been frozen solid 3 days prior, and we were attempting various thawing methods. Dr. Yoshimura suggested trying direct heat application, a method we hadn't tested yet. He handed me a torch, the kind used for soldering metal. He instructed, apply heat to the frozen limb. Let's see if rapid external warming can preserve tissue integrity better than gradual thawing. I took the torch without question. I ignited it, adjusted the flame to the specified temperature, and approached the subject. The man was conscious. They kept him conscious for all of it. His eyes followed my movements, wide with an emotion I'd learned not to name. I applied the flame to his frozen arm. The smell came first, burning flesh mixed with something else, something chemical and wrong. The frozen tissue began to char before it could thaw, turning black at the edges. The man was screaming, or trying to. They'd gagged him to reduce disruption to the experiment. And I just kept going, adjusting the angle, moving the flame systematically across the frozen tissue, recording observations in my mind that I would transfer to paper later. Interesting, Dr. Yoshimura murmured beside me. The tissue is combusting before adequate thawing occurs. Reduce flame temperature by approximately 30% and try again on the other arm. So I did. I froze his other arm, and then I burned it too, more slowly this time, at a lower temperature. The man lost consciousness somewhere during the second attempt. Another data point to record. Subject tolerance threshold exceeded at approximately 18 minutes of direct thermal application. When the experiment concluded, I cleaned my equipment, filed my report, and went to dinner. I ate a full meal. I even laughed at something Dr. Tanaka said, though I can't remember what it was. That night, lying in my bed, I thought about what I'd done. I'd tortured a man for hours, burning his frozen flesh while he was conscious and aware. And I'd felt nothing. No guilt, no horror, no remorse. Just clinical interest in the results. That's when I understood. I hadn't been corrupted by Unit 731. I had become Unit 731. And the most terrifying part, I didn't know how to stop.
I need to tell you about the other divisions, because frostbite research was only one small piece of what happened at Unit 731. The facility was enormous, and each division had its own specialty, its own particular brand of horror. The Plague Research Division was the largest. Dr. Tanaka worked there, along with dozens of other scientists. Their work was considered the most important, the most strategically valuable. They bred plague-infected fleas by the millions, testing different strains of bacteria, different delivery methods, different infection rates. They would inject subjects with plague bacteria and monitor the progression of disease, but not to cure it, to perfect it, to understand exactly how quickly it killed, how it spread, what symptoms appeared and when. They were weaponizing suffering. I saw the plague subjects sometimes when I passed through the corridors connecting different sections of the facility. They were kept in special isolation cells, their bodies covered in the black buboes that gave the disease its name. The smell was indescribable. Rotting flesh, fever sweat, and something else, something sweet and wrong that plague brought with it. Some subjects were exposed to airborne plague, locked in chambers while infected material was sprayed into the air. Through observation windows, we could watch them breathe in their own death, see the exact moment they realized what was happening. Others were fed contaminated food or water. The scientists needed to know how plague would spread through different vectors, which methods were most efficient for potential use against enemy populations. Dr. Tanaka told me once, during one of his drinking sessions, that they'd gone through over 3,000 plague subjects in a single year. 3,000 people, infected and observed and documented until death. "Do you know what the worst part is?" he asked, his words slurred. "It works. Everything we're learning, it works. We're creating the most effective biological weapons in human history. And I'm good at it. I'm so good at it." He started crying then, silent tears running down his face while he poured another drink. The vivisection division was on the 3rd floor. Dr. Sato ran that section, a meticulous man who never raised his voice and always wore perfectly pressed uniforms. His work focused on understanding human anatomy through live dissection. They didn't use anesthesia. That was the point, to observe organ function in a conscious, living subject, to see the heart beating in an open chest cavity, to watch lungs expand and contract, to trace nervous system responses in real time. I was required to observe several vivisections as part of my general training. The first one, I had to leave the room halfway through. The second one, I stayed but couldn't watch. By the 5th one, I could observe the entire procedure while taking notes. That's how it happened. Not all at once, but in increments, each one making the next easier. The subjects would be strapped to tables, their bodies opened systematically while they were fully conscious. Dr. Sato would narrate his observations in a calm, educational tone, like a professor teaching medical students. Except medical students worked on cadavers, not people who were screaming and begging and praying to gods who couldn't hear them. Note the cardiac response to direct mechanical stimulation, he would say, touching a heart beating in an open chest cavity, while the subject convulsed against their restraints. Observe the pulmonary reaction to partial deflation. Document the renal function during systemic shock. They kept subjects alive as long as possible, sometimes for hours, observing how different organs failed, what happened when certain systems were compromised, how the body tried desperately to survive as it was being taken apart piece by piece. And then there was the Pressure Research Division, where Dr. Nakamura worked. They had massive chambers that could simulate different atmospheric pressures. They would test how much pressure a human body could withstand, how quickly they could decompress someone before their organs ruptured, what happened to tissues at different altitudes. I heard the screams from that division sometimes, even through the thick walls. When pressure changes too rapidly, bodies don't just die. They explode from the inside. Eyes burst from sockets, lungs tear themselves apart. Blood vessels rupture throughout the entire body. Dr. Nakamura prayed before every experiment because he knew exactly what was about to happen. He'd seen it hundreds of times. And he'd keep watching, keep measuring, keep recording, because that's what we did. That's what we'd all become. There was also chemical weapons testing, where subjects were exposed to mustard gas, phosgene, cyanide compounds. There was bacterial research beyond plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, dysentery. There was surgical experimentation, where they would perform unnecessary operations just to practice techniques, removing organs that didn't need removing, amputating healthy limbs to test different surgical methods. Some divisions worked on blood replacement, draining subjects completely and trying to refill them with substitutes, horse blood, seawater, chemical compounds. Most subjects died within minutes. Some lasted hours, their bodies fighting against the foreign substances flooding their veins. Others studied starvation, dehydration, exposure to radiation. Every possible way the human body could be stressed, damaged, or destroyed was being investigated somewhere in Unit 731. And all of it was documented, meticulously, methodically, scientifically documented. We had a library of data that no other research facility in the world could match, because we had no ethical constraints, no oversight, no one to tell us where the line was. There was no line. There was only the work. At night, when I couldn't sleep, I would think about the subjects in their cells, hundreds of them, waiting for their turn. They knew what was happening. They could hear the screams from the laboratories. They could smell the smoke from the crematorium that ran 24 hours a day, burning the evidence of our work. Some of them tried to escape. They never succeeded. The facility was too secure, the guards too numerous. Those who tried were punished by being sent to the worst experiments, the ones even other scientists wouldn't volunteer to oversee. Some tried to kill themselves. We prevented that too. They were too valuable as research subjects to waste on suicide. We kept them alive, kept them healthy enough for experimentation, kept them in that liminal space between hope and despair where compliance was easiest to maintain. I saw the same subjects, sometimes weeks apart, sent to different divisions for different experiments. Each time a little more damaged, a little more hollow, but still alive, still useful.
It was a child that finally broke through my carefully constructed walls. They brought children to Unit 731. Not many, but enough. The official justification was that we needed data on how different age groups responded to various conditions. Pediatric research, they called it, as if that sterile term could disguise what we were really doing. Her name was May. I shouldn't know that. We weren't supposed to learn their names, but I overheard a guard mention it, probably without thinking, and the name stuck in my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. She was 7 years old, small for her age, with hair cut short and uneven, like someone had done it with dull scissors. Her eyes were too large for her thin face, and they followed everything with the alertness of prey animals. She was assigned to my division for cold exposure research, standard protocol. Dr. Yoshimura treated her no differently than any other subject, running through his checklist with the same clinical detachment he always displayed. But I couldn't do it. Not this time. I stood there with my clipboard, watching as they prepared her for the experiment, and something inside me that I thought had died completely suddenly came roaring back to life. "She's a child," I heard myself say. Dr. Yoshimura looked up from his preparations, surprised. "Yes, that's why she's valuable for this particular study. We have limited data on juvenile cold tolerance thresholds. She's 7 years old. Approximately, yes. The exact age is uncertain, but physiological development suggests..." "Stop!" The word came out harder than I intended. "We can't do this." The laboratory went quiet. The two assistants stopped what they were doing. Dr. Yoshimura removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture I'd learned meant he was carefully choosing his words. "Yamamoto," he said quietly, "are you refusing to participate in authorized research?" The weight of that question hung in the air. Refusing meant questioning. Questioning meant suspicion. Suspicion meant becoming a subject yourself. We all knew that. It was the unspoken rule that kept everyone compliant. But I looked at May, standing there in her thin cotton garment, and I saw my younger sister at that age. I saw every child I had ever known. I saw a person, not a log, not a specimen, not a data point. I saw what we'd become. "I'm saying we need to reconsider our methodology," I said carefully, trying to find words that wouldn't get me killed. "The data from juvenile subjects may be too variable to be scientifically useful. Growth rates differ significantly. Hormonal factors are inconsistent. Developmental stages create too many confounding variables." "That's precisely why we need the data," Dr. Yoshimura interrupted. But there was something new in his voice. Not anger, but wariness. "Your concern is noted, but the research will proceed as scheduled." He turned back to his preparations. The moment passed. I had a choice to make. I could pick up my clipboard and continue. I could document whatever they did to this child with the same clinical detachment I'd shown for months. I could rationalize it the way I'd rationalized everything else. Greater good, necessary sacrifice, advancing medical knowledge, serving the nation. Or I could choose to be human again. "No," I said. Dr. Yoshimura froze. "Excuse me? I won't participate in this experiment. I can't. She's a child. Children aren't enemy combatants. They're not prisoners of war. They're not criminals. What possible justification?" "Guard," Dr. Yoshimura called out, his voice sharp. "Inform the commander we have a disciplinary situation." 2 guards appeared in the doorway. They'd been listening, of course. They were always listening.
As they led me away, I looked back at May one last time. She was watching me with those two large eyes, and I couldn't read the expression on her face. Hope, fear, confusion, or maybe just the blank acceptance that came from being in a place where hope didn't exist. The walk to Commander Ishii's office felt both endless and too short. My mind raced through scenarios, each one worse than the last. Execution was possible. Becoming a subject was more likely. They'd want to make an example, show what happened when loyalty wavered. I thought about my parents, who believed I was doing important work for our country, about my younger sister, who'd written me letters full of pride about her brother, the scientist, about the life I'd had before this place, when I still believed that science was inherently good, that knowledge itself was neutral. Commander Ishii's office was on the top floor of the administrative building. His secretary, a severe woman with steel gray hair, gestured for me to wait without looking up from her desk. I sat in a wooden chair and waited for my judgment. The door opened after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. Commander Ishii stood in the doorway, his owlish eyes studying me through those round glasses. "Dr. Yamamoto," he said, pleasantly, as if we were meeting for tea. "Please, come in." The office was surprisingly normal. Desk, filing cabinets, a few plants on the windowsill. There was a photograph on his desk showing him with his family, smiling at the camera like any proud father and husband. That photograph bothered me more than anything else in that room, because it meant he could be both things at once, a loving family man and the architect of systematic atrocity. We all could be. That was the real horror. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. I sat. He settled into his own chair, steepled his fingers, and regarded me with an expression that might have been curiosity, or might have been the look a scientist gives a particularly interesting specimen. "Dr. Yamamoto tells me you refused to participate in authorized research. He also tells me you questioned our methodologies and justifications. Is this accurate?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" The simple directness of the question caught me off guard. I'd expected accusations, threats, immediate punishment. Not this calm inquiry, as if he genuinely wanted to understand. "She's a child," I said quietly. "But you can justify what we do to adults?" His eyebrows rose slightly. "Interesting. What's the moral distinction you're drawing here, Doctor?" I don't know anymore."
Commander Ishii leaned back in his chair, studying me like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve. "Do you know why I selected you for this unit, Dr. Yamamoto?" he asked. "Because of my academic record, I assumed." "No." He shook his head. "You were third in your class, not first. If I wanted pure academic excellence, I had better options. I chose you because your entrance essay talked about duty, about sacrifice for the greater good, about being willing to do difficult things if they served a higher purpose." He pulled a folder from his desk drawer and opened it. My application file. He'd kept it all this time. "You wrote, 'A true scientist must be willing to pursue knowledge wherever it leads, even into uncomfortable territory. Progress requires sacrifice, and I am prepared to make that sacrifice in service to my nation.'" He looked up at me. "Do you remember writing that?" I did. I'd been so proud of those words, so certain of my conviction. It felt like a lifetime ago. It felt like a different person entirely. I was naive, I said. You were idealistic, he corrected. And idealism is useful. It motivates people to do extraordinary things. But you're right that it was naive, because you thought the sacrifice would be yours, didn't you? You thought you'd be sacrificing your time, your comfort, maybe even your safety. You never imagined you'd be sacrificing your conscience. The accuracy of his observation felt like a physical blow. What we do here is necessary. You understand that intellectually, even if you're struggling with it emotionally. Every soldier who doesn't die from plague because we perfected a vaccine, that's a life saved. Every civilian who survives an epidemic because we understand disease transmission, that's a life saved. The few we sacrifice here save millions. That's the justification everyone uses, I said, finding my voice. But the subjects downstairs aren't enemy soldiers. They're farmers, teachers, merchants. That child is 7 years old. How does torturing her save millions? Because knowledge doesn't discriminate, Ishii replied calmly. The data we gather from her will apply to all children, Japanese children. If we understand how juvenile physiology responds to extreme cold, we can save Japanese children from freezing to death in harsh climates. Her suffering prevents the suffering of countless others. That's not medicine. That's barbarism dressed up in medical language. Is it? He leaned forward. Tell me, Dr. Yamamoto, what's the difference between what we do and what any medical researcher does? We all cause suffering in pursuit of knowledge. The only difference is the subject. Animal researchers torture mice and rabbits, and nobody questions it because we've decided those lives matter less. We've simply extended that logic. They're not animals, they're people. Are they? His voice remained infuriatingly calm. They're enemies of our nation. They're condemned criminals and prisoners of war who would be executed anyway. We're giving their deaths meaning, purpose. Without our work, they'd simply be buried in unmarked graves, their deaths accomplishing nothing. Instead, they contribute to the advancement of medical science. If anything, we're honoring their deaths by making them meaningful. The twisted logic was almost hypnotic. I could see how people believed it, how I had believed it. It was so much easier than facing the truth. You don't believe that, I said quietly. I can see it in your eyes. You know exactly what we're doing here. For just a moment, something flickered across Commander Ishii's face. Not anger or defensiveness, but something else. Something almost like relief that someone had finally acknowledged the obvious lie we all told ourselves. What I believe is irrelevant, he said. What matters is the work. What matters is that Japan survives and thrives, whatever the cost. History will judge us, Dr. Yamamoto. But history is written by victors, and I intend for us to be victorious. He stood up, signaling the conversation was nearing its end. You have a choice to make, he said. You can return to your division and continue your work. Everyone has moments of doubt. That's natural, even expected. We can forget this incident occurred. Or, he let the word hang in the air. Or I can become a subject myself. Not necessarily. He walked to the window, looking out over the compound. There are other options. I could have you transferred to a different facility, one where the work is less direct. Administrative duties, perhaps. Data analysis from research others have conducted. You'd still be contributing, but at a distance. It was a lifeline, and we both knew it. A way to preserve my life while salving my conscience. I could tell myself I'd objected, that I'd stood up for what was right, even as I continued to benefit and support the system I claimed to oppose. And the child, May, what happens to her? The experiment will proceed with or without your participation, Ishii said flatly. One scientist's crisis of conscience doesn't halt critical research. Dr. Yoshimura has other assistants. So my choice changes nothing for her. No, he agreed. Your choice changes nothing for her. It only determines what happens to you. I thought about May downstairs, waiting in that laboratory. I thought about all the other subjects in their cells, waiting for their turn. I thought about the thousands who had already died here, and the thousands more who would die regardless of what I decided in this moment. And I realized something that made me feel hollow inside. Commander Ishii was right. My individual choice changed nothing. The machine would continue running with or without me. The experiments would continue. The data would be collected. The suffering would go on. But there was one thing my choice would change. It would determine what kind of person I was. Whether I was someone who walked away from evil when I recognized it, even if walking away didn't stop the evil. Whether I could live with myself afterward. I can't go back, I said. I can't participate in this anymore, directly or indirectly. I can't analyze data I know was gathered through torture. I can't write reports that help justify what happens here. I can't be any part of this machine, even the parts that feel distant and clean. Commander Ishii turned from the window to face me. His expression was unreadable. You understand what you're choosing? He asked. Yes. You could be executed as a traitor. You could become a subject yourself. Even if I'm merciful, your career is over. Your reputation will be destroyed. Your family will be shamed. I understand. He studied me for a long moment, then did something I didn't expect. He smiled. Not a cruel smile, but something almost sad. You know what's interesting, Dr. Yamamoto? You're the first person in 2 years to refuse. The first one to look at what we do here and say no. Commander Ishii walked back to his desk and sat down heavily, suddenly looking much older than his years. Everyone else either believes the justifications, or they're too afraid to object, or they've simply stopped caring, he continued. But you're genuinely choosing conscience over survival. It's almost admirable, almost foolish. I'm not sure which. He picked up his telephone and spoke quietly to someone. I couldn't hear the words, but I braced myself for whatever would come next. Guards, probably. Imprisonment. Maybe worse. But when he hung up, he just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I'm not going to execute you, he said finally. And I'm not going to make you a subject. Do you know why? I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. Because part of me envies you, he said quietly. You still have the luxury of choosing morality over duty. You can walk away and live with the consequences of that choice. I don't have that option anymore. I'm too deep in this. I've given too many orders, signed too many authorizations, overseen too many deaths. There's no walking away for people like me. He opened another drawer and pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. He poured generous amounts into both and slid one across the desk to me. I'm going to have you transferred, he said, to a clerical position in Tokyo. You'll process supply requisitions for various military medical facilities. Boring work, safe work, and far enough removed from the reality of what those supplies enable. You'll never have to see another subject, never have to record another death. I stared at the glass of whiskey in front of me, trying to understand what was happening. Why? I asked. Because someone needs to survive this with their humanity intact, he said. Someone needs to be able to tell the truth about what happened here, if the time ever comes. And because... He paused, taking a long drink. Because I want to believe redemption is still possible, even if not for me. He stood up again, this time with finality. You'll leave tomorrow morning. You'll sign documents swearing you'll never speak of what you saw here. You'll accept the transfer gratefully and serve out your position without complaint. And you'll carry the weight of what you witnessed for the rest of your life, because that's the price of keeping your soul. And May? I asked again, even though I knew the answer. His face hardened. Dr. Yoshimura will continue the experiment with another assistant. The research will be completed. The data will be recorded. She will die, probably within a week, and her death will contribute to our understanding of pediatric cold exposure thresholds. He leaned forward. And you will live with the knowledge that you couldn't save her, that your moral stand changed nothing for her. Can you accept that? Could I? Could I walk away knowing that my refusal to participate didn't stop her suffering, didn't prevent her death, didn't change anything except my own complicity? I have to, I said, because the alternative is going back to that laboratory and becoming the person I was 3 hours ago, and I can't do that anymore. Then we have an understanding. He picked up some papers from his desk. These are your transfer orders. Sign them. I signed. My hand was shaking so badly the signature was barely legible, but it was done. You'll spend tonight in guest quarters, not the regular barracks. Better if you don't see your former colleagues before you leave. There will be questions you're not prepared to answer, and conversations that would be uncomfortable for everyone. He walked me to the door, and just before opening it, he put a hand on my shoulder. It felt wrong, this gesture of almost camaraderie from a man who orchestrated daily atrocities. You asked if I believe the justifications I gave you earlier. The truth, I don't know anymore. I stopped examining my beliefs years ago, because examining them meant confronting what I've become. You're brave enough to confront it. That's your salvation, or your curse. Probably both. He opened the door. A different guard waited outside, one I didn't recognize. Escort Dr. Yamamoto to guest quarters. He is not to return to his division or speak with other research personnel. He leaves at 0600 tomorrow. The guard nodded and gestured for me to follow. As we walked through the corridors of Unit 731 for what would be the last time, I passed by the laboratories where I'd spent the last several months. Through one doorway, I could see Dr. Tanaka hunched over a microscope.
Through another, Dr. Nakamura was adjusting pressure chamber settings. The normal rhythm of the facility continued around me, indifferent to my small act of rebellion. I passed by the cells where subjects were kept. Through the small windows in the heavy doors, I could see faces. Some stared at nothing, broken by what they'd already endured. Others watched the corridor with desperate hope that never led anywhere. I wondered which cell held May. The guest quarters were sparse but clean. A bed, a small desk, and a single window that looked out over the compound walls to the Manchurian landscape beyond. The guard locked the door from the outside. Not quite a prisoner, but not quite free either. I sat on the bed and finally let myself feel everything I'd been holding back. The horror, the guilt, the shame, the grief, not just for what had happened today, but for all the days before it, for all the times I'd rationalized, justified, participated, for all the people I'd hurt in the name of science and duty and national pride. I thought about the woman with the frozen hands, the man I'd burned while his arms were still frozen solid, the plague victims I'd walked past without a second glance, the vivisection subjects whose screams I'd learned to ignore, every single person I'd reduced to data points and measurements. And I thought about May, who was probably in a laboratory right now, experiencing the same cold horror I'd inflicted on so many others. Except this time, someone else was holding the clipboard. Someone else was recording her suffering in clinical, emotionless language. My absence changed nothing for her. That was the unbearable truth. I had chosen my conscience, and she would die anyway. I pulled out my notebook, the one where I'd recorded months of experimental data, and opened it to a blank page. And I began to write. Not scientific observations, but the truth, the real truth, without justifications or sanitizing language. I wrote about what we did at Unit 731, about the people we tortured and killed, about how easily educated men convinced themselves that atrocity was advancement, that suffering was science, that cruelty could be noble if the cause was worthy enough. I wrote until my hand cramped, filling page after page with testimony, because Commander Ishii was right about one thing. Someone needed to remember. Someone needed to carry the truth, even if they couldn't speak it yet. Outside my window, the sun was setting over Manchuria, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that would have been beautiful anywhere else. But here, all I could see was blood.
I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, not the blurred, dehumanized logs I'd trained myself to see, but people, real people with lives and families and dreams that ended in laboratories like the one I'd worked in. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside my door. They stopped, and for a moment I thought someone was coming for me, that Commander Ishii had changed his mind, that mercy was too dangerous a precedent to set. But then I heard a voice, barely above a whisper, speaking through the crack beneath the door. "Dr. Yamamoto?" I recognized the voice. Dr. Nakamura, the pressure chamber researcher who prayed before every experiment. "I'm here," I said quietly, moving closer to the door. "They told us you refused an experiment, that you questioned the work." A long pause. "Is it true?" "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear him breathing on the other side of the door, working up the courage to say whatever he'd come to say. "I've wanted to refuse for 18 months, Every single day I've wanted to walk away, but I'm afraid. I have a wife and 2 daughters back home. If I'm branded a traitor, what happens to them? I don't know, I admitted. You're braver than I am. And he said it with something like agony in his voice. Or maybe just more foolish. I can't decide which, but I needed you to know you're not alone in how you feel. Some of us still know what we're doing is wrong. We just don't have the courage to stop. Then stop, I said urgently. If you know it's wrong, if you hate what you're doing. I can't. The words came out broken. I'm a coward, Dr. Yamamoto. I choose my family's safety over my conscience every single day, and I'll keep choosing it until this war ends or I die. I pray for forgiveness, but I keep doing the unforgivable. That's who I am. That's who they've made us. That's what this place does. It turns good people into... No, his interruption was sharp. Don't absolve us like that. They didn't force us. They gave us justifications and opportunities and looked the other way, but every single one of us chose to participate. We chose to believe the lies because believing them was easier than accepting what we really are. He was right. The truth of it settled into my bones like poison. I should go, he said. If I'm caught here, it will raise questions. But I wanted you to know what you did today mattered. Maybe not for the subjects, maybe not for the war, but for those of us who are still trying to hold on to pieces of our humanity. You reminded us that refusal is possible, that someone can still say no. His footsteps retreated down the corridor, leaving me alone again with my thoughts. But an hour later, there was another visitor. This time the footsteps were heavier, accompanied by the distinct smell of alcohol. Dr. Tanaka. "Yamamoto, you stupid, stupid fool!" I didn't respond, unsure what to say. "Do you know what you've done? You've made the rest of us look like monsters. Before you, we could all pretend we were just doing our jobs, following orders, serving the nation. But now there's someone who refused, someone who looked at the same situation we see every day and said no. And that means the rest of us are saying yes, actively, consciously saying yes." "I didn't do it to make you feel guilty." "Well, congratulations anyway, because I feel like hell." He laughed, a bitter sound. "You know what the worst part is? I'm angry at you. I'm angry at you for having the courage I don't have, for making me see myself clearly for the first time in years. I was happier when I could pretend we were all equally trapped, equally helpless, but you proved that's a lie." "Dr. Tanaka." "I hope you make it out of here," he interrupted. "I hope you get to live a normal life, get married, have children, grow old. And I hope every single day of that life you remember what we did here. Not because I want you to suffer, but because someone needs to remember. Someone needs to carry the weight of what happened so the rest of us can pretend to forget." He left without another word, his unsteady footsteps fading into the distance. The rest of the night passed in silence. I sat at the small desk, continuing to write in my notebook, documenting everything I could remember. Names, or the names I'd heard whispered by guards who were careless. Dates, details of experiments, the layout of the facility. How many subjects approximately? How many divisions? What kinds of research? I didn't know if this testimony would ever matter, if anyone would ever read it, if there would ever be a reckoning for what happened here. But I wrote it anyway, because it was the only thing I could do. As dawn approached, I heard the facility coming to life around me.
Footsteps in corridors, doors opening and closing. The low rumble of the crematorium starting its daily work. The machinery of atrocity beginning another day of operations. Somewhere in the building, Mai was probably waking up, if she'd been able to sleep at all. Somewhere, Dr. Yoshimura was preparing for the day's experiments. Somewhere, subjects were being moved from cells to laboratories, beginning the walk they wouldn't return from. And I was leaving. I was walking away while it all continued without me. The knowledge sat in my stomach like a stone. I hadn't saved anyone. I hadn't stopped anything. I had simply removed myself from direct participation while the system I'd helped build and maintain continued destroying lives. Was that courage or cowardice? Morality or selfishness? I didn't know. I still don't know. At exactly 0600, the lock turned in my door. A guard stood there, the same one from yesterday, his face carefully neutral. "It's time, Dr. Yamamoto. Your transport is ready." I gathered my few belongings, some clothes, my notebooks, the transfer papers Commander Ishii had given me. Everything I owned fit into a single small bag. Somehow, that felt appropriate. I was leaving this place with almost nothing, which was more than the subjects in their cells would ever leave with. The guard led me through corridors I'd walked hundreds of times before, but everything looked different now. I saw the facility clearly for the first time, not as a research center or a military installation, but as what it really was, a factory of suffering, a monument to humanity's capacity for cruelty. We passed Dr. Yoshimura in one corridor. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Disappointment, perhaps, or maybe contempt. He didn't speak, just turned away and continued toward his laboratory. We passed the cells. Through one small window, I caught a glimpse of a face. I don't know if it was Mai. I'll never know. But I looked into those eyes for just a second, and I whispered a prayer. Not to any specific deity, just a desperate plea to whatever force might listen. Please, let this end soon. Let her suffering be brief. It was a coward's prayer, but it was all I had. The guard escorted me to the main gate, where a military truck waited. Other soldiers were loading supplies, preparing for the journey back to Tokyo. "This is where I leave you," the guard said. He hesitated, then added quietly, "For what it's worth, what you did yesterday took guts." Before I could respond, he turned and walked back through the gate, which closed behind him with a heavy, final sound. I climbed into the back of the truck, finding a space among the crates and supplies. A few minutes later, the engine roared to life, and we began to move. As the truck pulled away from Unit 731, I looked back through the open canvas at the facility shrinking in the distance. From outside, it looked so ordinary, just buildings and walls. You couldn't hear the screams from this distance. You couldn't smell the crematorium. You couldn't see the horror contained within those walls. That was the most terrifying thing of all, that such evil could exist in such an ordinary-looking place, that it could be conducted by ordinary people who went home at night and wrote letters to their families and believed themselves to be good men serving a noble cause.
The war ended 8 months after I left Unit 731. I was sitting at a desk in a gray office building in Tokyo, processing requisition forms for medical supplies when the announcement came over the radio. The Emperor's voice, thin and crackling through the static, speaking words I never thought I'd hear. Surrender. Around me, other clerks sat in stunned silence. Some wept, Some looked relieved. Some just stared at nothing, trying to process what this meant for our country, our future, our lives. All I could think about was Unit 731. What would happen when the Americans came, when they discovered what we'd done in Manchuria? Would there be trials? Executions? Would the world learn the truth about the research facility that was never supposed to exist? I was about to find out. The Americans arrived in Japan like a wave, occupying, investigating, interrogating. They were looking for war criminals, for evidence of atrocities, for people to hold accountable. I waited for them to come for me, for someone to match my name to the Unit 731 personnel records. But they never did. Instead, I heard rumors. Whispers passed between former military personnel, fragments of information that slowly assembled into a horrifying picture. Commander Ishii had made a deal. The Americans wanted the data, all of it. Every experiment, every observation, every piece of research we'd conducted. The biological warfare information especially. They were terrified the Soviets would get it first. So they offered immunity. Full immunity for everyone involved in Unit 731 in exchange for exclusive access to our research. No trials, no accountability, no justice. The scientists who'd conducted experiments would go free. Some would even continue their research, now funded by American institutions. Dr. Yoshimura, I heard, ended up working for a pharmaceutical company. His expertise in cold weather medicine highly valued. Dr. Tanaka disappeared into academia, teaching microbiology at a prestigious university. And the data purchased with thousands of lives, documented in excruciating detail, became classified American military research. The suffering we'd inflicted, the deaths we'd caused, all of it was hidden away in filing cabinets and used to advance the very biological warfare programs it was supposed to expose. The victims were erased, the perpetrators were protected, and I was left to live with what I knew. I tried to speak up once. I went to an American officer, a young man with kind eyes who was helping with the occupation efforts. I told him I had information about war crimes, about a facility in Manchuria where thousands were killed in medical experiments. He listened politely, took notes, and told me someone would follow up. No one ever did. I realized later that they already knew. They knew everything, and they decided the data was more valuable than justice. They decided our expertise was worth more than accountability for our crimes. So I kept my notebooks hidden. The testimony I'd written that last night at Unit 731, the details I'd documented, the truth I'd tried to preserve, all of it stayed locked in a box in my apartment, gathering dust while I tried to build some kind of normal life. I got married. Her name was Yuki, a kind woman who worked as a teacher. I never told her where I'd served during the war. When she asked, I said I'd been in medical administration, which was technically true. She didn't push for details. Many veterans didn't want to talk about the war, and she respected that silence. We had 2 children, a son and a daughter. I held them as infants and thought about all the children who died at Unit 731. I watched them grow and learn and laugh, and I wondered who May might have become if she'd been given the chance.
I worked various jobs over the years. Nothing important, nothing medical. I couldn't bring myself to practice medicine after what I'd seen, what I'd done. How could I? How could hands that had documented torture now heal? How could eyes that had watched atrocities now look at patients with compassion?
So I worked in offices, filing papers, managing inventory, doing work that required no moral complexity. And I lived with the weight of my memories. The worst part was how normal life became. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. I went to work, came home, ate dinner with my family, helped my children with homework. On the surface, I was just another Japanese man rebuilding his life after the war. But at night, I still saw their faces. The woman with frozen hands, the man I'd burned, the plague victims in their cells, and always, always, May, the child I couldn't save, whose death I couldn't prevent, whose suffering I could only refuse to personally document. My wife sometimes asked why I had nightmares, why I'd wake up gasping, covered in sweat, whispering apologies to people she didn't know. I told her it was just the war, just memories that wouldn't fade. She'd hold me and tell me it wasn't my fault, that I was a good man, that I shouldn't torture myself over things I couldn't control. She didn't know. She couldn't know. How could I tell her what I'd been, what I'd done? Years passed. My children grew up and had children of their own. Japan rebuilt, transformed from a defeated empire into an economic power. The war became history, something in textbooks, something old men talked about vaguely over drinks. And Unit 731 remained a secret. Oh, there were occasional mentions, researchers who stumbled across references, journalists who asked questions, but the official records had been destroyed. The facility had been demolished. The Americans kept their files classified, and those of us who'd been there, most of us kept silent. Some stayed silent out of self-preservation. Why confess to crimes that no one was prosecuting? Some genuinely believed what we'd done was justified, that the data we'd gathered was worth the cost. Some simply wanted to forget, to move on, to pretend those years never happened. And some, like me, stayed silent because we didn't know what else to do, because speaking up hadn't worked when I tried, because the world had decided our research was more valuable than our accountability, because carrying the guilt privately felt like a punishment we deserved. But silence has a cost too. Every year on the anniversary of the day I left Unit 731, I would take out my notebooks and read through them, force myself to remember in detail what I'd witnessed, what I'd participated in. It was my own form of penance, making sure I never forgot, never let the memories soften with time, never allowed myself the comfort of rationalization. My granddaughter found the notebooks once, when she was 14. She was looking for something in my study and came across the box I kept hidden in the back of a closet. "Grandpa?" she asked, her young face confused. "What are these? What do all these words mean?" I moved never faster in my life. I took the notebooks from her hands, my own shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. "They're nothing," I said, too sharply. "Just old work documents, nothing important." She'd looked hurt by my tone, and I'd spent the rest of the day trying to make it up to her, buying her ice cream and listening to her talk about school. But that night, I looked at those notebooks again and realized something that made my blood run cold. I realized that my granddaughter would inherit this silence. She would grow up never knowing what her grandfather had done. She would remember me as a kind old man who took her for ice cream and told her gentle stories. And when I died, the truth would die with me, unless I did something about it. But what could I do? I was 73 years old. Most of the other Unit 731 personnel were dead or dying. The governments that had protected us had their own reasons for maintaining the cover-up. Who would listen to an old man's confession decades after the fact? Still, the question haunted me. My granddaughter's innocent face, finding those notebooks, not understanding what they represented. It crystallized something I'd been avoiding for 40 years. The victims deserved to be remembered. Their suffering deserved to be acknowledged. And those of us who participated deserved to be known for what we truly were. I started writing, not just notes anymore, but a full testimony. Everything I could remember about Unit 731, the layout, the divisions, the experiments, the people involved. I wrote about the justifications we used, the rationalizations that let educated men commit atrocities. I wrote about how it felt to lose your humanity piece by piece, and how impossible it was to get it back. I wrote for 6 months, filling notebook after notebook with memories I'd tried to bury. My wife noticed, asked what I was working on so obsessively. Something I should have done years ago, I told her. It was the closest I'd come to honesty in our entire marriage. When I finished, I had over 300 pages of testimony, detailed, specific, damning. I made copies, multiple copies, and began trying to figure out what to do with them. I sent one to a journalist at a major newspaper. It was returned unopened, with a polite note saying they weren't accepting unsolicited submissions. I tried contacting historians who specialized in the war period. Most didn't respond. One who did told me kindly but firmly that without corroborating evidence, a single elderly man's claims wouldn't be publishable. Too controversial, he said. Too many powerful people would prefer this remain buried. I tried international human rights organizations. Some expressed interest, but ultimately backed away, citing concerns about verification and political complications. Every door closed in my face. It seemed the world had decided that Unit 731 was better left forgotten. I was sitting in my study, staring at the stack of rejected testimonies, when my son came to visit. He was 45 then, a successful businessman with his own family. He found me surrounded by papers, looking defeated. "Father," he said, concern in his voice, "what is all this?" And for the first time in my life, I told someone in my family the truth. I told him everything. Where I'd really served during the war, what Unit 731 was, what we did there, what I participated in, what I witnessed, what I finally refused to do. I showed him the notebooks, the testimony, the rejection letters. He listened without interrupting, his face growing paler with every word. When he finished, he sat in silence for a long time. "Did you kill anyone directly?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," I said. "I documented their deaths. I recorded their suffering.
I enabled the system that killed them. Is that better or worse? I don't know anymore. Why didn't you tell us? There was pain in his voice. Why did you let us believe you were just an administrator? Because I was ashamed. Because I didn't want you to know what your father really was. Because I struggled for words. Because I wanted to protect you from the truth. But silence protects the perpetrators, not the victims. I understand that now. My son stood up and walked to the window, his back to me. I could see his shoulders shaking slightly.
"What do you want to do with this?" he asked, gesturing at the testimony. "I want the world to know," I said. "I want the victims to be remembered. I want there to be a record, even if there's no justice, even if it's too late for accountability. The truth matters, doesn't it? Even 40 years late?" He turned to face me, and I saw tears on his cheeks. "It matters," he said. "But Father, you understand what this will do to our family, to your grandchildren. They'll grow up knowing their grandfather was involved in—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "I know," I said quietly, "and I'm sorry, but carrying this secret has poisoned me for 40 years. Every smile, every family dinner, every moment of happiness has been tainted by the knowledge of what I did, what I failed to stop. I can't carry it anymore, and I shouldn't. These aren't secrets that should be protected." My son was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "I need to think about this. Can you give me some time?" I nodded. He left, taking one copy of the testimony with him. 3 weeks later, he came back. With him was a younger man, a documentary filmmaker named Kenji, who specialized in controversial historical subjects. "He'll help you," my son said simply. "He'll record your testimony on video. He has contacts with international media who might be willing to cover this. It won't be easy, and there will be backlash, but he believes your story deserves to be told." Kenji was in his early 30s, with intense eyes and a quiet determination that reminded me of myself at that age, before Unit 731, before I learned what I was capable of becoming. "Mr. Yamamoto," he said, "I need you to understand something. If we do this, your life will change. People will hate you. Some will call you a traitor for breaking decades of silence. Others will call you a liar, claim you're making it up for attention. Your family will face harassment. Are you prepared for that?" I looked at my son, who nodded slightly, giving me permission, or perhaps forgiveness. "I've been preparing for this for 40 years. Let's begin." We spent the next 3 months filming. Kenji interviewed me for hours, asking detailed questions, pushing me to remember specifics, to describe not just what happened, but how it felt, how we justified it, how we lived with ourselves. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Harder than refusing that experiment with May. Harder than living with guilt for 4 decades. Because this time, I wasn't just carrying the truth privately. I was speaking it aloud, putting it on record, making it real in a way it had never been before. I told him about the divisions, the experiments, the people I'd worked with. I described the frostbite research in painful detail. I talked about the woman with frozen hands, about burning a man's arms while he was conscious, about the day I finally said no and what it cost me.
I talked about the deal Commander Ishii made with the Americans, how justice was traded for data, how the perpetrators went free and the victims were forgotten. And I talked about the weight of silence, about how it protects the guilty and erases the innocent, about how I'd let fear and shame keep me quiet for decades when I should have been shouting the truth from the beginning. Kenji filmed all of it, every word, every tear, every moment of painful honesty. When we finished, he looked at me with something like respect and said, "This is powerful. This is important. I'll do everything I can to make sure people hear it."
The documentary aired 18 months later on an international news network. Kenji had done his work well. He'd found corroborating evidence, tracked down other former Unit 731 personnel who reluctantly confirmed parts of my testimony, and connected with historians who could provide context. But my interview was the centerpiece. An elderly man sitting in a simple chair, describing in clinical detail the horrors he'd participated in more than 4 decades earlier. The response was immediate and explosive. Within days, the story had spread across the world. News outlets picked it up. Historians began demanding access to classified files. Survivors' families, those few who had known their loved ones were taken to Unit 731, finally had confirmation of what had happened. And the backlash came, just as Kenji had warned. Former military personnel called me a traitor, accused me of fabricating stories to gain attention or harm Japan's reputation. Some of the other Unit 731 scientists who were still alive issued denials, claiming I was exaggerating or mentally unstable. The Japanese government officially stated they had no comment on unverified allegations about wartime activities. The American government remained silent, their classified files staying classified. But the truth, once spoken, couldn't be silenced again. Other former Unit 731 personnel began coming forward, some confirming my account, others adding their own testimonies. The wall of silence that had protected us for decades began to crack. My family paid the price I'd known they would. My son's business suffered as clients quietly distanced themselves. My daughter-in-law received threatening letters. My grandchildren faced bullying at school, taunted about having a monster for a grandfather. My granddaughter, the one who'd found my notebooks years earlier, came to see me one evening. She was 19 now, studying history at university. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" she asked, and there was anger in her voice, but also something else, a need to understand. I said, "Because I was a coward, because I prioritized my comfort, my family's reputation, my own peace of mind over the truth, the same way I prioritized my career and my safety over the lives of the subjects at Unit 731. I made the same choice over and over again to protect myself instead of doing what was right." "But you did tell the truth eventually," she said. "Doesn't that count for something?" "Does it?" I asked. "The victims are still dead. The perpetrators mostly lived full, comfortable lives. Justice delayed for 40 years isn't really justice at all. It's just finally stopping the lie." She sat with that for a moment. "At school, we're learning about historical memory, about how societies deal with past atrocities. My professor said that silence is a form of continued violence against victims, that every year we don't acknowledge what happened, we're choosing the perpetrators over the victims again. Your professor is right, I said. But you broke the silence, she pressed, even though it cost you everything, even though people hate you for it. That took courage, didn't it? I shook my head. No, courage would have been refusing to participate from the beginning. Courage would have been speaking up 40 years ago when it might have mattered, when there might have been justice. This is just the bare minimum of human decency, delivered decades too late. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said quietly, for what you did, for staying silent, for the pain this has caused our family. Good, I said. You shouldn't forgive me. What I did is unforgivable. I just hope you can understand why I finally told the truth, even if it was too late. Someone needed to remember the victims. Someone needed to say their suffering happened, that it mattered, that it wasn't justified by science or duty or national interest. She nodded slowly. I'm writing my thesis about Unit 731, about how and why it remained hidden for so long. My professor thinks it's important work. It is, I agreed, much more important than anything I did in that facility. You're documenting the truth without participating in the horror. That's what I should have done from the beginning. She left shortly after, and I sat alone in my study, thinking about her words, about courage and cowardice, about justice and accountability, about whether speaking the truth decades late was worth the cost it extracted from innocent people who had nothing to do with my crimes. I didn't have good answers. I still don't. The documentary continued to generate attention. Kenji did follow-up interviews, expanding the investigation. More evidence emerged, photographs that had been hidden, documents that survivors had kept, testimony from Chinese civilians who remembered the facility. The picture that emerged was even worse than what I described. Unit 731 had killed at least 3,000 people in direct experimentation, possibly many more. And those were just the direct victims. The biological weapons we developed killed tens of thousands more when they were used against civilian populations. All in the name of science, all justified by the belief that we were serving a greater good. International pressure mounted for Japan to officially acknowledge what had happened, to apologize, to compensate survivors and families. The government resisted, caught between political pressures and the desire to avoid confronting this dark chapter of history. I testified before human rights organizations, spoke at universities, gave interviews to journalists from the world over. Each time, I told the same story, forcing myself to relive those years in Manchuria, to remember the faces of the people we'd killed, to acknowledge the full weight of what we'd done. It was exhausting, it was necessary, and it was, in its way, the only form of penance available to me. But nothing I said or did could bring back the dead. Nothing could undo the suffering we had caused. The best I could do was ensure they were remembered, that their deaths weren't hidden away in classified files and protected by decades of silence. One day I received a letter from China. It was from an elderly woman who said her brother had been taken by Japanese soldiers in 1941 and never returned. For decades she'd wondered what happened to him, where he died, whether he had suffered. Your testimony, she wrote, at least gives me answers. I know now that he was taken to Unit 731. I know that he suffered terribly. I know that his death meant something to someone.
even if it was only as data in a scientific experiment. It's not closure. There can be no closure for something like this, but it's truth. And after 40 years of not knowing, truth is something. I read that letter over and over, tears streaming down my face, because she was thanking me for telling the truth about her brother's murder, thanking me even though I was part of the system that killed him, even though my testimony came decades too late to provide any real justice. I wrote back to her, though I don't know if she ever received my letter. I apologized. I told her I was sorry for what happened to her brother, sorry for the system I participated in, sorry for the decades of silence that compounded the injustice of his death. I told her that his brother's suffering had haunted me, along with all the others, and that if I could undo any of it, I would. But I couldn't. All I could do was ensure his death was acknowledged, his suffering recognized, his life, however it ended, remembered. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was all I had left to give.
I am 91 years old now. My wife passed away 3 years ago, never having fully understood what I'd been part of, though she stayed beside me through the aftermath of my confession. My son visits occasionally, our relationship forever changed by the truth. My granddaughter finished her thesis and became a historian, dedicating her career to documenting wartime atrocities and fighting historical amnesia. Sometimes I think about what she said years ago, that silence is a form of continued violence against victims. She was right, but I've also learned that speaking isn't absolution. The truth doesn't erase what happened. It just refuses to let it be forgotten. I still have nightmares. At 91, you'd think the memories would fade, that time would soften the edges of guilt. But May's face is as clear to me now as it was that day I refused to participate in her torture. The woman with frozen hands, the man I burned, every single person whose suffering I documented in clinical, emotionless language. They visit me in my dreams, and sometimes I'm grateful for it, because forgetting them would be the final betrayal, the ultimate act of cowardice. The facility at Pingfang was demolished by the Soviets after the war, where laboratories once stood, where thousands died. There's now a museum, a memorial. The Chinese government built it, ensuring that what happened there wouldn't be forgotten. I've seen photographs, though I've never had the courage to visit in person. How could I? How could I stand in that place as a tourist, as someone seeking understanding, when I was one of the people who made that memorial necessary? The Japanese government eventually issued a statement acknowledging that regrettable activities occurred at certain wartime facilities. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't accountability. It was the bare minimum admission, phrased in language so vague it could mean almost anything. But it was something, a crack in the wall of denial. Other former Unit 731 personnel never spoke up. Some died, taking their secrets to their graves. Dr. Yoshimura passed away in his sleep at 83, having lived a long, prosperous life. His obituary praised his contributions to medical science, made no mention of where that expertise came from. Dr. Tanaka drank himself to death. Dr. Nakamura spent his final years in a monastery,
Whether seeking redemption or escape, I don't know. And Commander Ishii, he died of throat cancer in 1959, having never faced trial, never been held accountable. He gave his data to the Americans and lived out his days in comfortable anonymity. That's perhaps the hardest truth to accept, that most of us faced no real consequences. We lived normal lives, had families, enjoyed peaceful old ages, while the people we tortured and killed remained frozen in time, forever young, forever suffering in the moments we documented. I think about the deal Ishii made with the Americans often, how our research was deemed too valuable to be punished, how data gathered through unspeakable cruelty became classified military assets, how the price of thousands of lives was apparently worth paying for information about biological warfare and human physiological limits. That knowledge is still being used, still influencing medical and military research. Everything we learned about frostbite, about disease transmission, about human tolerances, it didn't disappear. It's buried in classified files, stripped of context, sanitized of the horror that produced it. Sometimes people ask me if I think the research had value, if the data we gathered, terrible as the methods were, at least contributed to saving other lives later. I always say no, not because the data wasn't scientifically useful, it probably was, but because accepting that justification means accepting that human lives can be weighed against knowledge, that some suffering is acceptable if it produces useful information, that the ends can justify the means. And once you accept that logic, there's no limit to the atrocities you can rationalize. I learned that firsthand.
My granddaughter published her thesis. It became a book that's now used in universities around the world, teaching new generations about Unit 731, about how ordinary people become participants in extraordinary evil, about the importance of breaking silence and confronting uncomfortable truths. She dedicated it to the victims whose names we'll never know, whose suffering we can never fully comprehend, and whose memory demands that we never forget. When she showed me the dedication, I cried, because she understood something it took me 40 years to learn, that the victims, not the perpetrators, deserve to be centered in this story. That remembering them isn't about our guilt or our redemption, but about acknowledging their humanity, their suffering, their right to be mourned and remembered. I asked her once if she was ashamed to be related to me. She thought about it for a long time before answering. "I'm ashamed of what you did," she said finally. "I'm angry that you stayed silent for so long, but I'm also grateful that you finally told the truth, even when it would have been easier to stay quiet. You don't get credit for doing the right thing decades late, but at least you did it eventually. That's more than most people in your position can say." It's a harsh assessment. It's also fair. I'm writing this now because I know I don't have much time left. My health is failing, and soon I'll face whatever judgment awaits people like me. I don't know what I believe about the afterlife, about divine justice, about whether there's redemption possible for someone who did what I did. But I know this:
The victims of Unit 731 deserve to be remembered. Their names, their faces, their lives that were stolen from them in the name of science and national duty and all the other justifications that evil hides behind. Remember that ordinary people, educated, cultured, intelligent people committed these atrocities, not monsters, just humans who made terrible choices and found ways to live with those choices. Remember that silence protects perpetrators and erases victims. That speaking uncomfortable truths matters, even decades late. That accountability is worth pursuing, even when justice seems impossible. And remember to question authority, to challenge justifications, to refuse participation in systems that dehumanize others, no matter how reasonable those systems seem, no matter how noble the stated goals, no matter how many people tell you it's necessary. Because I learned too late that the line between civilization and atrocity is much thinner than we want to believe. That good people can do monstrous things when they're given permission, justification, and enough distance from the consequences of their actions. I was a scientist at Unit 731. I participated in experiments that tortured and killed thousands of innocent people. I stayed silent about it for 40 years, prioritizing my comfort and safety over truth and accountability. I can never undo what I did. I can never bring back the dead or ease their suffering. All I can do is tell the truth, however late, however inadequate, and hope that someone, somewhere, learns something from my failures. The weight of what we did at Unit 731 can never be fully expressed in words, but it must be carried, must be acknowledged, must be remembered. Not so that I can find peace, I don't deserve peace, but so that the victims aren't forgotten, so that history doesn't sanitize what happened, so that future generations understand the cost of choosing duty over morality, silence over truth, comfort over courage. That's my testimony. That's my confession. That's the truth I should have spoken 50 years ago. I was a scientist at Unit 731, and what we did was worse than you know. Not just because of the specific atrocities, but because of how easily we convinced ourselves they were justified, how quickly we normalized the unthinkable, how long we stayed silent about the unspeakable. May the victims rest in peace. May their memory be a blessing and a warning, and may none of us ever forget.